Hello, and welcome to week 2. This week we're going to be exploring race and how racial identity affects people in our society. So, what exactly is race? Race is a set of categories that are socially constructed based on physical characteristics, primarily the color of a person's skin, but also things like hair texture and the shape of facial features, like eyes, nose, and mouth. What do we mean when we say socially constructed, though? It means that we as a society, a group of people, have created and agree with the concept that it makes sense to categorize people by skin color. We've done this for so long and so extensively that it seems completely normal, and it's hard to imagine not having racial categories. But there is no biological basis for race. We are all essentially the same, skin color just being one genetic variation like height, eye color, or foot size. Before we can define racism, we need to talk about a few other concepts. The first of these is prejudice. Prejudice is based on individual attitudes towards any group of people. You can be positively or negatively prejudiced. Discrimination is prejudice in action. Discrimination is what happens when you see a person's social group identity and make a choice, consciously or unconsciously, to treat someone more positively or more negatively based solely on that social group identity. Racism, then, is a negative prejudice by people with a dominant social group racial identity towards people with a marginalized social group identity, and the discrimination that results from that prejudice. This discrimination happens at all levels of interaction, from the individual interactions all the way to the way institutions create rules and how those institutions interact with wider society. Here we have our full working definition of racism. Please pause for a moment and make sure you read it thoroughly. It is absolutely crucial to understand that racism always includes an element of social power. Everyone has prejudices, both positive and negative. Some are justified, some are irrational, many are learned. However, for racial discrimination to happen, one must have the leverage of having a socially dominant racial identity gives you. To explain, let me use an example. This is a photo of Amy Cooper, who made national news recently. She was walking her dog off leash in a section of Central Park where dogs are not allowed to be off leash. A bird watcher in the area, a black man named Christian Cooper, no relation, asked her to put her dog on a leash. After a bit of back and forth, Amy Cooper threatened to call the police, saying, "I'm going to tell them there's an African American man threatening my life." She then proceeded to follow through on her threat, calling 911 and reporting that an African American man was threatening her and her dog. We live in a period where there is significant evidence that black men are treated more harshly than people of other races and genders by police. There is also heightened awareness of this tendency. Amy Cooper was aware of this. She knew that she, as a white woman, could call the police, and that the most likely scenario was that, in a case of he said, she said, her story would be believed instead of the story of a black man. Even more so, she thought the threat of this uneven treatment would be enough to bully Christian Cooper into letting her continue flaunting the laws regarding the park. This is exactly what I mean by having racial power. Christian Cooper did not have the same option of calling the police to force Amy Cooper to obey the law. His story was unlikely to be believed, and was more likely to result in him being punished for calling than for her to be punished for actually breaking the law. Amy Cooper tried to leverage this power, even knowing she was in the wrong. Now, because Christian Cooper published his account on social media and it went viral, we know about this story. Because of all the attention, Amy Cooper faced some pretty significant backlash. And admittedly, this was a pretty clear-cut case of a white person abusing their racial privilege. However, similar situations to this are happening all the time. If Christian Cooper hadn't had so many other privileged identities, a Harvard graduate, a former Marvel Comics editor with a large fan base, a member of the board of directors for the New York City chapter of the Audubon Society, would his story have had as much weight? Would his story have gone viral in the same way? So, last week we talked generally about oppression and noted that oppression comes in two forms, individual and systemic. Racism, as a form of oppression, follows this pattern. We can have individual thoughts and acts of racism, which is usually what we think of when we think of racism. There are also systemic types of oppression, though. We can divide these into two categories, institutional and structural. Institutional racism is where the rules of an institution are designed to discriminate, consciously or unconsciously, and are then carried out by individuals. You can think of this as the sorry, I'm just following the rules sort of racism. Structural racism is system-wide discrimination across society that is built into social structures. This is the way it's always been type of racism. So then, what does racism look like in practice? This is what most of us think of when we think of racism, right? The KKK in white hoods and robes burning crosses across the southern states, right? And yes, that sort of racism still exists. The KKK is still a real active organization and has actually seen an increase in membership in the last few years. And it's not the only organization of its sort that exists. This is only one type of organized, overt racism, though. Interpersonal, individual interactions can be racist as well. Sometimes it's overt and easy to recognize, such as individuals in the KKK. More often, though, there are things said in everyday conversation that many with dominant racial identities won't even recognize as a problem. We refer to these as microaggressions. In most cases, what's happening here is pointing out that a person is not from the dominant racial identity, which means not white, or doesn't fit the stereotypes we have of various racial groups. This graphic provides a number of examples. Where are you from? No, really, where are you from? Is something aimed at people who are not white, and implies the assumption that Americans are all white, and if you aren't, you must be from somewhere else. You don't act like a normal black person. Says that that person isn't conforming to the stereotypes of black people, and implies that there is only one way to be a black person. What do you think about that? What do your people think about that? It's a particularly problematic microaggression. This usually puts the single person of color in the room on the spot, and asks them to speak about the opinions for an entire group of people, which just isn't possible. It also implies that the person asking that question doesn't know or interact with other people of that background. Now, I think most people, particularly white people, see these as innocent questions without malice behind them, and that's likely true. However, a lack of malice doesn't mean these comments aren't hurtful, and that they don't continue enforcing a system that deems whiteness as normal and the default, and anything else as other. This is what is meant when people talk about intent versus impact. A note about the term microaggressions. Micro in this context doesn't mean it has a small impact. It means that it's on a small societal scale, that it happens during interactions between individuals. The impact on the person affected can be significant. Institutional and systemic racism might be overt. The KKK is an example of a racist institution. But most often it's subtle, 1,000 tiny barriers to accessing information and resources. We can only discern this sort of racism by examining patterns. For example, we can see a pattern of higher rates of cancer, heart disease, and diabetes in black people compared to white people. We can see that black people are far more likely to be incarcerated than white people, or Latinx people. We can see that black children are far more likely than white children to be suspended from school. We can see that black and Hispanic Americans are far more likely to live in poverty than whites, or Asians. Asians are an interesting case, and we'll dig into why that is next week. Overall, though, we can fairly easily discern that black Americans are far more likely to suffer from what is known as societal problems than white Americans. The big question is, why? What causes this difference to exist? To try and answer that question, we're going to watch a video next about the GI Bill, and then take a close look at the law, how it was implemented, and what the patterns show us about the effectiveness of that implementation.